When I left home for college, I decided that my old Royal manual typewriter was just too bulky to take with me. I had used it to type all of my high school papers, and it had served me well. So when I got to college, I used the coin operated typewriters in the library. Well, I was relieved when my sister came to college the following year with a new Corona Electric. Now preparing my term papers wouldn't take any time at all. Well, nobody had computers in those days. Well, businesses, of course, had mainframes, and the computer science labs had terminals. But the very earliest personal computers were just starting to become available. My dad worked for IBM, so I felt like I knew something about computers. They were large, expensive, and nobody had one at home. Until one day, about a year after I had graduated from college, my dad brought home a brand new IBM personal portable computer. I don't think the machine had actually been released for sale yet. Note that I called it a portable computer. This was no laptop. It was as big as a suitcase. I remember my dad gathered us around the kitchen table to show us this latest gizmo. He hefted it up to the table and put it on its side. There was a little latch on each side at the bottom where it stood on the ground. The bottom flipped down to become a keyboard and revealed what couldn't have been more than a 9-inch screen. Next to the screen were 2 slots for 5¼ inch floppy disks. I think the thing might have had a whopping 256 kilobytes of memory. We were amazed, to say the least. Not so much by what it could do, we didn't really know, but that we had a computer on the kitchen table. Actually, the heady days of personal computer development took place not in the 1980s when my dad brought this suitcase-sized portable computer home. That's when people started buying and using them. But rather in the 1970s, when much of the groundwork was laid. And the thing that would eventually come to define the way we interact with computers, the graphical user interface, came from what we might think of as an unlikely source. Today, it would be hard to imagine using any kind of device without GUI. It's used in various forms everywhere: computers, kiosks, cell phones, tablet devices, even appliances and automobiles. But in the 1970s, this was a novel idea. Computer scientists at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC, located near Stanford University, developed a graphical user interface for the Xerox Alto workstation, and eventually for the Xerox Star workstation. A graphical user interface is a computer program that gives a person a way to communicate with a computer through the use of symbols, visual metaphors, and pointing devices. Think of the icons, folders, and the mouse we use on our computers today, and you get the idea. The idea was considered a flop by Xerox because relatively few of these units sold. But a young computer developer named Stephen Jobs saw a GUI when he visited PARC in the late 1970s. And in true Steve Jobs form, a light went off in his head. He realized this is how people would interact with computers. Well, let's face it, the lines and lines of code that people would need to remember or reference in order to operate the computers of the 1970s, including the Apple I that Jobs and 2 others introduced in 1976, limited the market for these machines. There were a host of makers by the late 1970s, including Apple, Commodore, Atari, and Tandy. But all of these used text-based computer languages, such as BASIC, rather than the graphical user interface that PARC developed. Well, in the early 1980s, with a personal computer that Apple called Lisa, and then its Macintosh products, Jobs and his partner, Steve Wozniak, jumped into GUI in a big way. So if the 1970s were the heady days of personal computer development, the 1980s heralded the takeoff in consumer acceptance of this product. And this was mostly due to the new interfaces. The Macintosh, probably more than any other personal computing development, was really a game changer when it debuted in 1984. It was the first mass market personal computer with a graphical user interface and a mouse. A mouse, of course, is a small handheld device that you can use to navigate on the computer screen and direct your choice of action. Now, while the mouse has a development pedigree dating back to radar controllers during World War II, it was applied to computer operation in the 1960s. That's when the Stanford Research Institute patented it. Xerox's PARC Lab designed one for use with the Alto, and Bill Gates's Microsoft designed Word for use with a mouse. But it wasn't until the 1984 release of Macintosh that the mouse came into widespread use. So in the space of only about 5 or 6 years, the graphical user interface and its accompanying mouse device made computing accessible to the masses. For the most part, these were closed systems. Data, including text and images, were resident on the individual machines or shared via magnetic media like floppy disks and diskettes. Connecting these personal computers with larger networks required another technology, the modem. Large-scale data transfer networks in which computers could remotely connect to one another were beginning to be developed in the late 1950s and certainly by the 1960s, mostly to meet the needs of scientists and governments that were looking for robust data connectivity. The modem, the shorthand term for modulator-demodulator, allows one computer to connect with another computer and transfer data over regular telephone lines. In the early 1980s, primarily academic institutions and governments used the internet. But early internet service providers like Telenet, CompuServe, and a predecessor to Sprint began offering dial-up data transfer services to the general public. And toward the end of the decade, most personal computer manufacturers offered models with built-in modems, allowing their users to easily connect to the new data networks that were beginning to emerge. Now, when I compare my college experience from years ago and the developments in computer and information technologies when I was a young adult to recent years, when my own kids headed off to college with notebook computers and tablets and cell phones, the changes in just my lifetime seem staggering. Within only a few decades, an information economy had grown up as a result of these rapid technological innovations in computing and communications. Information is at our fingertips in a way that it never was before. But if we thought the availability and importance of information came only with computers and data networks, we would be missing a much longer-term process that has had a big impact on the way that businesses and the economy function. Actually, business information is crucial for economic performance over the long term, and it has been for centuries. So let's take a few minutes to look back over the past 500 years to review the changes that have taken place in the ways business information is acquired, transmitted, and employed. There are several very general observations that we can make about information exchange over the centuries, since the development of the printing press in the West. First, the quality of the information got a lot better with the arrival of the printing press in the late 15th century. Second, the kinds of information, or really the way information was organized, changed and improved. Third, the speed with which information was transmitted increased dramatically. Fourth, the availability of information expanded in significant ways. Fifth, the cost of obtaining many types of information dropped. Sixth, the value of information itself rose and continues to rise. What do I mean by information getting better? In what ways was information organized better with the advent of printing? Well, if we think about it, the success of a business depended on the ability of its stakeholders to communicate with one another. That is, the various partners and agents and offices, for example. Today we use telephones, email, and various online services. But 500 years ago, merchants and their businesses also needed information in order to succeed. Even after the development of the printing press, firms often employed couriers to carry news about market conditions, as well as local events and the competition. They also used couriers to send instructions back and forth between the home office and the branch offices. The printing press allowed for greater standardization of information types and better ways to share business information. While there were many ways to share information, the printing press enabled commercial information to be organized into manuals, published price currents or price lists of current market prices for various commodities, and business newspapers. Information exchange within the firm was necessarily a confidential enterprise. And from a very early date, firms kept the notes and reports of their agents. In addition to newsletters and other correspondence, firms used these notes and reports to compile commercial handbooks as a way to transmit information within the organization. So many merchant manuals began as the private information that a merchant and the agents of a firm compiled. Whether for the private consumption of merchants within these firms or with an eye toward distribution to a wider audience, the merchants compiled and published items in their area of expertise to share. In more modern times, these often took the form of policy manuals and training manuals. Most early manuals contained information on weights and measures and currency exchanges, arranged by region. Early merchant manuals in particular focused almost exclusively on this kind of information. Merchants, however, needed access to information about unfamiliar markets and new products, whether they were acting individually or working for a large firm or acting as a functionary of one of the new joint stock companies of the 17th century. The great variety of merchant manuals ensured that merchants of all stripes could obtain virtually any type of business information. Authors striving for a complete presentation of commercial information included such a vast array of topics that their books could be used by young and aspiring merchants as well as by well-heeled practitioners. Merchant manuals presented their readers with a variety of advantages over other forms of communication. The earliest manuals focused on the nuts and bolts of commerce, general instructions on calculating currency and measurement exchanges. These kinds of manuals were common during the 16th and 17th centuries. Manuals intended for the instruction of merchant apprentices were also common at the time. During the 17th century, books that focused on trade regulations began to appear. Commercial dictionaries also became available by the end of the 17th century, and even more during the 18th century. Trade and travel literature describing important commercial cities and extra-European commercial centers were also important during the 18th century. Rather than displacing more traditional ways to exchange information, merchant manuals presented their users with a new medium for obtaining commercial knowledge. But manuals were just one way that the quality of information improved. There were other kinds of information that businesses needed, and they needed this kind of information much more quickly than manuals could deliver it. Manuals could give an idea of prices in distant lands, but current prices were much more valuable. Actually, the information on prices and other business news from distant markets was valuable itself, and in the era before the printing press was often a closely guarded secret. In book form, merchant manuals started the process of profiting from the gathered information. And when merchants realized that they would profit even more by speeding up the process of information exchange, the business press in the form of newspapers and printed price lists was born. Business newspapers in their earliest days were simply printed price lists and exchange rates originated at Antwerp in the 1540s. At first, these were rather simple affairs and likely first printed by the exchange brokers in the city. But the process of compiling price lists, while essential, was probably a big enough job that the brokers simply licensed the rights to a merchant to start a price list publishing business. At this point, the priced currents became a regular publication, available for sale or subscription. While merchant manuals continued to be published, the new idea of publishing price and exchange lists spread rapidly. After Antwerp, publishers of price currents emerged in Amsterdam, London, Venice, and other European commercial cities. And in America, price currents were published in Philadelphia in the 1780s. Why were these kinds of lists published when prior to the printing press, the information they contained was considered to be something akin to a trade secret? Well, according to John McCusker, the scholar who probably has most closely studied the topic, there were three reasons for these types of publications. First, publishing price currents, essentially lists of market prices for goods, was quite simply a great way to advertise the commerce of a city to the world. Merchants could quickly find out what products were for sale in a particular market and what prices they could fetch. The principal benefit was that more sellers and buyers would be attracted to a city if they knew what prices and products were sold there. Second, publishing prices and exchange currents was also a more efficient form of information exchange than the old courier systems where a rider on horseback galloped from place to place, and even more up to date than merchant manuals. The information they contained was regular, reliable, and detailed. Third, a profit could be made in publishing these kinds of price and exchange lists. The business press was set up to make money. And what was the big money maker? It was the information the publications contained. The information itself had a value. This is a topic I'll return to in a few minutes, but I want you to keep it in mind. Now, by the 18th century, several more types of things were published in the business press, including stock market price lists. Something like the Wall Street Journals published lists of the New York Stock Exchange closing prices, and data on shipping and commodities entering and leaving the city's markets. Once these types of information were combined into a single publication, the result was essentially a financial newspaper in the more modern sense of the word. Now let's couple these new published business newspapers with the old courier services, and we can see that the transmission of information could increase dramatically, even before the next great technological innovation. Merchants and firms could now subscribe to several price currents and other business newspapers, which were delivered to their doors, greatly improving efficiency by increasing the availability of information and the speed with which it could be delivered. Another technological shift with profound effects on the emerging information economy was the telegraph, introduced in the 19th century. The telegraph reduced the time for information to travel across vast distances, so that communication was received almost in real time. Telegraph messages didn't travel instantly, though it surely must have seemed that way at the time. But messages that used to take days or even months to arrive by postal courier, whether by horseback or ship, now took only minutes to transmit by telegraph. The telegraph succeeded in unifying markets both within a country and between countries. Well, business newspapers didn't go away with the telegraph, but with this new technology, the information itself could be transmitted from one place to another and then compiled into a newspaper. Once communications cables were laid across the ocean floor, business information could be transmitted between continents and around the world. Cables were already being laid under the sea between Great Britain and the continent, and between Europe and North America in the 1850s and 60s. In the 1870s, telegraph cables tied together Europe, the Far East, and even South America. Once cables crossed the Pacific at the turn of the 20th century, a worldwide information network connected all of the major continents and major countries of the world. This was an important moment in time for communication, and the network continues to this day. Now, it isn't telegraph cables on the ocean floor that connect us. It's fiber optic cable that forms the world's internet connections. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The telegraph offered a variety of enhancements to business communications by replacing the long-distance courier and by changing the process for updating information in the business press. But it also had even more far-reaching effects. Once the telegraph was applied to transmitting price data, essentially in real time, the business of business information changed even more than it had with the printed price currents. For me, the most interesting development in this regard was the introduction of the stock ticker. A man named Edward Callahan, who was the chief telegraph operator in New York, came up with the idea of printing out the stock price streams from the telegraph. What was the need that inspired this? Well, much like the price currents of the 17th and 18th centuries, 19th century traders wanted even quicker access to the constantly changing price information of stocks and other commodities traded on exchanges. The system that was in place when Callahan came up with his idea relied on messenger boys to run around New York City with slips of paper that contained not only buy and sell orders, but the prices too. Callahan realized that if each brokerage firm had a machine that could receive and print out the current prices, the system would be much more efficient. Oh, and it was called a ticker because of the sound it made when printing out the messages onto a long strip of paper or tape, hence the term ticker tape. So in 1867, Callahan introduced his gold and stock ticker and founded the Gold and Stock Telegraph Company. And soon he had hundreds and eventually thousands of subscribers to his service. In 1872, Callahan moved to London, where he was instrumental in setting up a ticker service in Great Britain. Over the next several years, a variety of improvements were made in stock ticker technology. But with the introduction of the stock ticker, the speed and availability of information increased and expanded significantly. Now, the stock ticker, like the telegraph, was a 19th century invention, but it continued to be used until the 1970s. Those who are old enough might remember the ticker tape parades that New York City held on special occasions. We still have ticker tape parades, but we use confetti or shredded paper nowadays because the stock ticker no longer prints out the prices. Rather, by the early 1980s, stock tickers had been replaced by those lighted, moving text displays that display price quotes. Our needs for information were continuously being met by new methods of delivery. The prices reported in newspapers and even via electromechanical devices like the stock ticker still relied on clerks and others to compile the information. The introduction of computers during the late 1930s and 40s, such as the U.S. Navy's Mark I, which was introduced in 1938 to calculate torpedo firing, and the Colossus computer delivered in 1943 for use in code breaking, changed the way information was handled. It wouldn't take long before commercial applications for this technology were proposed. During the 1950s, new developments in electronics, especially the transistor, were introduced into computers, making them much more versatile than electromechanical models that could really only be used for one purpose. And by the 1960s, computer use had spread to business. Why did business begin to adopt computers? Well, for the same reasons it always adopts new technologies, in order to solve problems, increase efficiency, and lower costs. Over time, computers actually changed the way business units functioned. Accounting and finance, which once relied on armies of bookkeepers and adding machines, switched to computers fairly early on, and certainly by the 1970s. The dissemination of computers had a variety of effects. Efficiency was increased and costs went down, but workforce reductions also occurred. With the computer, fewer workers were needed, and tasks were completed more quickly and with fewer errors. Increasingly, computers were used not only to perform specific tasks, but also by managers to generate and analyze information of all kinds. And what's more, firms began sharing information within their organizations and with a variety of outside stakeholders like suppliers, wholesalers, financial institutions, and even customers. So now we've come full circle back to the introduction of personal computers and the digital networks that emerged in the 1970s and 80s. My point so far has been to point out that the information economy was gradually building over a period of centuries. With this, the cost of accessing information decreased, while at the same time the value of information, or at least certain types of information, increased. And the reason for this has to do with the creation of the so-called information superhighway in the 1990s. The promise of rapidly increasing computing power, personal computers, and large-scale data networks was not lost on computer scientists or policymakers. Ideas about what this new information superhighway might do and how it would change our lives were bandied about informally and in policy papers all over the world. In the early 1990s, U.S. Vice President Al Gore invoked the term information superhighway to describe the rapid changes that have been taking place since computer scientists connected UCLA's computers with Stanford's in Northern California in 1969. The idea was that the internet would transform the lives of people, as information could be accessed in homes, and schools, and businesses all over the world at the click of a button. The idea was also that this vast reservoir of information would be available at virtually no cost to people of all income. At one level, the dream of the information superhighway has indeed come true. In 1995, not long after the introduction of the World Wide Web, which is a network of internet servers, users could access about 110,000 sites. And that was a more than 100-fold increase from 1,000 available sites just 1 year earlier. Today, the number is upwards of 180 million websites. And the number of people who have access to the web has risen from some 10 million to more than 3 billion. That's almost half the world's population. But these massive numbers hide some inequalities in information access. A kind of information third world exists between those who have access and those who don't. It's estimated that almost 90% of North Americans have web access, and roughly 75% of Europeans do. Compare that to 40% of all Asians and only 28% of all Africans. We can see that the dream hasn't reached the entire world yet. And the internet isn't used only for information storage and retrieval. As it has come to dominate so much of our lives, the information that passes across the internet has become even more important for the world economy than anything the information superhighway thinkers of the 1990s could have imagined. The flip side of internet access and the dream of the information superhighway, and one that is still unfolding, is the vast amount of data that's being collected from the 3 billion internet users around the world. This has implications for how businesses and governments use and potentially misuse that data. The data includes not only our internet viewing habits, but also the purchasing habits, reading habits, preferences, likes and dislikes of billions of people. Over the course of about 500 years, we've moved from a world in which access to information was expensive, slow, and often out of date by the time it was received, to a world in which information of almost unimaginable kinds is constantly available and up to date at a fairly low cost.